Hello and welcome. Thank you all for making time to be here with us today. My name is Sarah Stevens. Though we gather online today from many places, I am coming to you from the traditional, unceded, and the ancestral territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations in the place now known as Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I want to acknowledge my settler perspective and the need for settlers to work toward right relations with Indigenous peoples and encourage you to do the same. To learn more about the land that you are on, I will drop in the chat a suggested link where you can see more about the context of the land where you are.
And good evening from me as well. I'm Igor Marjanovic, and I too would like to acknowledge the indigenous cultures of Missouri and that we are here today on the traditional lands of the Illini people. At the same time, I would also like to acknowledge a tragic anniversary of George Floyd's death, which occurs precisely today. The writing of this book that we are about to launch today is in many ways shaped by the impact of and reckoning with this tremendous historical event.
We also want to thank all of the people who helped work on this project. A book project such as this never comes together without a great team. Myself, Igor, and Mark as co-editors would like to express our thanks to the work of the ACSA staff who supported this project from the beginning and to Oro Edition's editorial and production team. As a republication of many essays from the past, we are also indebted to the past executive editors, the associate editors, past board members of the JAE, and generations of contributors to the journal. Thank you all.
This book republishes essays from the journal's 75-year history with the intent to frame the expansion of scholarship in the field. The journal developed from a pre-war World War II bulletin called The Evolving Architect, a source of our own title, edited by the educator, researcher, and practitioner Walter T. Rolfe. From its earliest days, reporting on conference proceedings, the journal has focused on architectural education, but in doing so has revealed the pressures within and upon the field, whether from the internal debates between more technical or artistic approaches, or from allied fields such as engineering or planning. Increasingly, the role of research became more prominent, if no less contested, and more design content was included in the issues. We, the three editors, read all 75 years of the journal's issues and drew from that repository for 4 themes presented in this book.
The 4 themes are research, environment, pedagogy, and politics. For the research, and we had all these amazing covers as we read through all 75 years of the journal to keep us kind of engaged with the visual repository of materials. The theme of research, we really wanted to try and track changes from the post-war era of professional and governmental entities really working in tandem to craft the modernity of the field to something that was more an approach widely informed by critical theory, technology, and the recognition within the field that research itself is constantly shifting. For the theme of environment, we saw this theme really as describing the shifting meaning of the term itself, from meaning something like the urbanism around a building, to the biological origins of the term in milieu, to the psychosocial conditions of human existence, and really to one shaped more today by ideas of sustainability, climate change, and our understanding of the Anthropocene.
The pedagogy section. More about constants and evolution, perhaps, this section tracks concerns about what the architect needs to know and how it is the architect should actually learn. And finally, the politics. While politics first appeared in the journal through discussions of urban policy, particularly around the questions of urban renewal, it shifts over time to encompass the politicizing of history and identity and more strident calls for social action and advocacy.
We wanted to call some attention to the current board of the JAE here, and just to note again how many people contributed to this journal over its many years, many decades, as also a way for us to start introducing our panelists. So our panelists for today represent the current and future leadership of the JAE. While this book is reflective, of course, of the journal's past, going back into the deep cuts, we wanted the conversation really to focus on where things are today in the state of the journal and where they are going. So our co-editor of this book is Mark Naveau, who is at Arizona State University and is stepping down after a long tenure as the executive editor of the JAE shortly. The current design editor is Carolina Dyer, who's coming to us from Aarhus University in Denmark. Maybe wins the award for being up the latest at night to be with us. The current and the continuing editor of reviews is David Theodore, associate editor of reviews from McGill University in Montreal. We have the incoming executive editor, Nora Wendell, who will be taking over from Mark shortly, who is coming from the University of New Mexico. And we have the incoming design editor, Ozair Saluji, who is coming to us from Carleton University. We would like to encourage everyone to please use the chat and ask questions, share their thoughts and comments, and join the discussion with us this way. Our plan for the rest of our time together is to ask questions of the panelists, but we hope to leave significant time at the end for others to participate as well.
We asked our panelists today to select 2 essays from the book, which they believe we should go all and read again, as a way to springboard our discussion. We will do a first round to hear from everyone, and then go on to the second round to sort of select a set of recommendations that we can all sort of discuss as a collective. So I would like to begin by asking Carolina to please start and tell us maybe which essays caught her attention and could be read again anew in our own context. Thank you, Carolina.
Thank you, Igor and Sarah. Hello, everyone. I will share my screen. It's sharing, right? Yep. Working. So I first perhaps a few words about my perception of this curated selection of the book, which to me it's a kind of a meditation on the importance of memory and the kind of the relevance of going back to reread the questions that have been asked. So something that really amazed me about the curated selection of the book is how some of these issues and questions that the essay show, they exist in a constant state of circularity. And they allow us to perhaps reframe some of the questions we asked today. So I think there's a huge value in that recollection of memory and revival of some of these words by different authors. So the 2 essays that I chose, somehow they resonate with things that we're dealing with today in different environments and different cultures and different institutions. And I chose these 2 essays before I actually read the introduction and the words of the editors, because I just wanted to just have a kind of a clean view of what was the material selected. Then I saw that the editors actually have mentioned these particular essays in the introduction. But the first one is Writing Multiculturalism into Architectural Curricula by Regina Davis. And the essay shows a course that was taught at the University of California in Berkeley, co-authored by between Regina Davis and Ken Simmons, and the course attempted to give visibility to different minorities working in the architecture field, both practically, but also in theoretically. And the course engaged with the practice of writing and researching. So it wasn't through design itself, but actually writing and researcher, and having the students look at marginal practices, minorities from different cultures, to engage with what's not said, what's unseen. But the essay also offers a really interesting field of literacy that I think is important to open up, and perhaps we have forgotten. So throughout the essay, the author names and revisits books that were contemporary to the 90s, when the essay is published. And Voices in Architectural Education, for example, is an example that the students engage with in trying to open up the theme of what does it mean to actually look into a multicultural approach to architecture, Black culture and Black consciousness, the small home of tomorrow, the call of the ancestors, African-American architects in current practice, intercultural architecture, the philosophy of symbiosis. I missed one that was on Native women. But the interesting thing of the essay, I think, is that opens up something that I feel we need to engage with a lot today, which is, I think, a problem of literacy. What has been written, what is out there that has already dealt with issues that we're confronting today. And what does it mean today, the word multiculturalism? Because I think it's a rather contested word. Is it radical enough? Is it trying to conform with the status quo? How can we understand this word today, 30 years after, almost 30 years after this essay was published? So one of the things that I feel is really important with this essay, or why it will be interesting to read it today, is because I think it offers a really strong foundation for comparison and for reflecting on how other scholars were looking at this issue of multiculturalism, literacy, and the visibility of minorities, and whether those methods, research methods, have been successful or not, whether the numbers have changed, and whether concepts like multiculturalism, for example, do they remain valid structures to actually look into some of the contemporary issues we're facing today with all kinds of inequalities. So I felt it was a really thought-provoking essay, because it made me imagine all kinds of further studies, and I really wanted to go and reread many of these books that are shared. So I think the essay offers a really broad series of references, which are really valuable. And it also demonstrates how the students were engaging with the project. And then the other essay that I chose is one that is published in 2007, is a research in the studio. And I think somehow it's by Cassis Barnelis from Columbia University, and at the time University of Limerick, which poses the question of what is research in studio. And I think it relates or it speaks to me also with the other essay, because in this question of what is research, I think the methodological issue of are we using the tools of research that are still Eurocentric, that are still derived from Enlightenment forms of reading at work. And I think what Barnelis does in this essay, which I think is very interesting, is to problematize this issue of what is research in studio through design. And I think that's a question that the JAE has engaged with a lot, especially in the last years. And I just want to read this because I think it's interesting how in the text he references some of the origins of the journal. And he asks, but just where did the research studio come from? In search of an answer, we might turn back to turning back to the founding editor, Turpin Bannister, the research heritage of the architectural profession, in the first issue of the Journal of Architectural Education. Bannister traces a long tradition of research in architecture to the Renaissance, a lineage that he observes flourishing in the academies of the 18th and 19th centuries. Like scientists, Bannister notes architects once came together in professional meetings and publications to share their discoveries and to receive input from others. But to Bannister's lament, In the latter part of the 19th century, architects gave up their leadership in structural and technological innovations to engineering in favor of pursuing a purified art of design. With remarkable optimism, Bannister envisions the JAE as a key institution in renewing the role of the architect as researcher, capable of sustaining and encouraging such dialogue among architects. Regrettably, Bannister's hope for the JAE is hardly borne out by the evidence of subsequent years. The agenda set out in Bannister's first issue of the journal was immediately replaced by the publication of the proceedings of the annual meeting. When articles began a decade later, they were largely polemic about where architecture should go rather than specific accounts of research projects. So I think this topic of what is research today and what is being done in the studios, more than this discussion of where things should go is super important. And I find a lot of value in this problematization of research in studio. And then in the conclusion, he says, this then is the question that research studios need to address. Indeed, it is a broader litmus test for architecture, be it post-critical, critical, or otherwise. How does it help us to re-envision the world anew? By its nature, this suggests that we should not go with the flow, but rather redirect it utterly, remaking the terrain through which flows travel. If such a goal is somewhat immodest, I would nevertheless argue that the promise of such radical architecture is precisely what drives great architecture and what great architectural research. To do any less would be irresponsible. So I felt really inspired by these two essays, and I will recommend people to read them, but I think they also talked a lot about what scholarship is, and yeah, it opens up a lot of really current discussions today in the classroom and also in research. So,
yeah. Thank you, Carolina. That was wonderful. Mark?
Great, thanks. First of all, I just want to say thank you to Sarah and Igor for putting this together. It's I know it's a lot of work, and it was an incredible, somehow pleasurable experience to work with you on the book itself. I don't think we actually have met in person. I don't know how we pulled it together, but it was great. You're both amazing. So thank you for doing all that you do. Also, just a quick thank you to the other members who are on the board here today. The associate editors, the board members have all been incredible to work with. And it's just been a great experience. So I'm really happy to see some of you, even if it's just virtually. The essay I chose, and I didn't do my homework as well as Carolina, but so that's my slideshow. The essay I chose is Abigail Sachs' essay from 2000, I think it was, yeah, 2009. It was one of George Dodd's issues. The title is Post-War Legacy of Architectural Research. And one of the reasons I chose it is that I actually remember reading it. I didn't know Abigail at the time, but the essay is super clear, really well written. And the thing I really like about it is it makes a lot of connections, right? So it goes back to the very, very first issue of the JAE, whose topic, as Carolina just said, or just mentioned, was on research. And it actually opens up the question of the role of research and back in the post-war, so what was happening then, and then makes a series of connections to other things that also occur throughout the journal. So there's a bit about CRS, which was the topic of a number of essays, connects back to AIA and their interest in research. And then it connects also to programs at Berkeley and at Michigan. Early on, Berkeley and MIT were huge contributors to the journal. And so it just seems like this essay sort of brought together a lot of different components that we're already reading about as we read all 75 volume years of the journal. The other thing I wanted to mention is that Abigail wrote it, I believe, as a part of her dissertation, which is kind of interesting because that's a bit of a trend. We've seen the past 10 years or so, a lot of really, really, really good essays coming out of doctoral dissertations, be it a chapter or just a part of it. The essays are usually really well researched, they're well written, they're topical, and I think Abigail's essay is a really great example of this. So I would highly suggest, if you've not already, go check out Abigail Sachs's essay, post-war legacy of architectural research. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. David?
Hi, everyone. Good evening or good midnight to Carolina. When we were discussing tonight's events before we got started, I had a flashback to the editorial board meeting where we discussed what we might do for the 75th anniversary. And it just seemed like such a daunting amount of work. I felt like, you know, in gym class when you're just saying, don't choose me, don't choose me, don't choose me. So really thanks to you all for seeing it through. I can't believe how much work has gone into the 300 pages. And it's kind of that you emerged from that with some clear intellectual concepts is also intellectual work. So there's kind of hard work plus that good work that I really liked. One of the things about reading through it that struck me as well was, you know, that feeling you get when you hear a song on the radio you just haven't heard for years, and you realize you haven't heard it for years, but you know all the words. There are just sort of a whole bunch of things like that that just seem so familiar. And you know, they give you a little twitch, but then you think, my God, thank you that I don't have to listen to that anymore kind of feeling. It's a little bit of both in some of these essays. And one of the overall feelings like that I really took me by surprise was how much reading these things felt that people were moralizing, they were preaching at me, they were hectoring at me. Carolina just showed one where, you know, it would be irresponsible for architects to do something else, as if, I'm just trying to imagine who they were talking to that wants to be told that they're being irresponsible. And of course, the example I have is Alberto Perez Gomez, Architecture as Drawing, because it's Alberto 100%, you know, this is the true way to do true architecture. But I was surprised at how widespread that was throughout many of the essays. I just wasn't prepared for that sense of preaching. And who are you preaching to in these articles? But the one that I read it differently than I remember reading it at the time was Kate Bristol's article on Pruitt-Igoe. And what I mean by differently is I remember being introduced to it as a discussion about what the article is about. In other words, about whether public housing was somehow responsible for, you know, the decline of American values or something, and it had to be destroyed so that architecture could go on to some new glorious existence. But what she actually does really well in the essay is outline a problem or an issue or a way of thinking about architecture that is really, really deeply ingrained in how we think about architecture, which is just unable to rid ourselves of myths, what she calls myths. We probably wouldn't use that word anymore. But how do you, when something becomes a myth in your discipline, how do you root it out? What do you do? And she's conscious that, or it seems to me she's conscious that even by writing about trying to root it out, she's actually, you know, establishing it even stronger within the discipline. And we have so many of those in our discipline right now. I would say research is one of them as well. Research is a myth in architecture more than it is an actual discussion topic. And they're just hard to talk about because you're actually talking about, you know, Hercules on Mount Olympus or something. You know, it's really hard to talk about the actual issues. So I don't know that Pruitt-Igoe is really interesting to anybody anymore as the actual topic, but I think the essay is really good at thinking through where and how we can think about these myths. So to be precise and specific, at the end of this introduction to the essay, she's really worried that architecture, the myth supports a view of architecture where architecture can intervene directly in politics and economics and social issues in a way that she just can't find any evidence that it does. So why does this myth go on that it was architecture's fault in some kind of way? It's just, of all the old hits, that was my favorite to listen to again. Thanks.
Thanks, David. That was great. Ozair?
Wonderful. Thanks. Thanks so much, Igor. And congratulations also to Sarah, to Mark, and to Igor on the book. It's really a wonderful, wonderful project, and so grateful to have been invited to kind of think with you all a little bit on some of these texts. There are like so many wonderful texts that I had a very difficult time actually trying to identify just one or two. I really appreciated actually Catherine Anthony and Meltem Goodell's 2006 piece on the canon and the void, which I thought was was a remarkable piece of writing. I'm so glad that Carolina mentioned Regina Davis, because that was also one of the the texts that I was thinking about too. But if there's one for me, maybe in particular, in part actually because of a look back at some of the winter design studios that we taught at Carleton this year, two of which were hosted by faculty from Dark Matter University, and that they spoke about actually last week in another a webinar with ACSA, which was called, I think, Lessons in Anti-Racist Design Pedagogy. So, based on that, I think the text for me actually would be Craig Wilkins' 2000 piece called Wrapped Space, the Architecture of Hip-Hop. So in addition to reading the text, I would encourage you to watch the webinar last week and then get a playlist actually from Craig and from the DMU faculty, so that you can really get the sonic experience, I think, of some of the things that they talk about. But the text from Professor Wilkins, I mean, anything that he writes, I think should be read really. It really resonated with me because in the context of kind of thinking about these studios that just wrapped up and revisiting this piece that he wrote like 20 years ago now, it really underscored the idea of continuity and continuum of ideas and thoughts and inquiries that are visited, revisited, parsed, and reparsed. And so the Dark Matter University studios, which we were really fortunate to host this year, one was co-taught by Jaleesa Bloomberg and Curry Hackett, and the other by Kilian Riano and Jen Lowe. They were a part of this world that Professor Wilkins writes about in his text. And in particular, Curry and Jaleesa's studio looked at Black modes of cultural production and cultural methods from the African modern, from the modern African diaspora. So they looked at HBCU marching bands, at double Dutch, at ciphers, at voguing, at social dance styles, and more, as a way that collective authorship sort of reveals patterns, challenges, and how it fosters relations. And so I was really struck by how Professor Wilkins speaks to those very questions now, 20 years ago, about the interrelationships, certainly between music and architecture, but really about the fostering of relational spaces of pattern, of memory, of ceremony, and of the everyday. And I think what was especially meaningful for me personally was his description of the work of hip hop as what he called a self-defining energy that's dependent on experience and memory, that defines and communicates via patterns, and is created in this kind of collaborative and, as he says, performative, adaptive, and palimpsestic and anthropomorphic, nature of space and architecture. And so I would just be really, very excited to encourage all of you to read Craig Wilkins' text. I think it's really quite wonderful.
Great, thank you, Ozair. Nora?
Thank you so much. Well, we knew this was going to happen at some point, that we would have a repeat of an article. And I wanted to thank David Theodore for his description of the Pruitt-Igoe myth. That was the essay that I chose, and it was also something that I found to be a useful read to go back and turn to, because in many ways it felt contemporary. And I also loved the fact that it built on Mary Comarillo's work at UC Berkeley 20 years prior, which was another essay that was actually published in the Journal of Architectural Education. So there's kind of a legacy, I think, in the journal of turning over that subject. And I think Catherine Bristol's essay certainly does it in a way, as David says, by reanalyzing, rediscussing the myth, in some ways it reinforces it, but also her deep analysis of the process of the buildings being commissioned, being designed, the moment that the Federal Housing Administration or the HUD intervenes in the project and demands that Yamasaki actually make 33 11-story towers. It's an interesting article because it actually follows the entire process all the way through, from the urban renewal processes to the very end when it's demolished, but orients that process backward. So I found her essay, or in some cases puts the demolition forward. But I would say that I would never assign that to my students again without William Russell Ellis's review of Defensible Space by Oscar Newman. That review was remarkable, and in ways that Catherine Bristol is not explicit about how terrible Oscar Newman's work truly is. I would say William Russell Ellis is much more precise in his critique of it. And I wanted to read just one excerpt of it. He writes, "This book is an ideologically corrupt, but meticulous and thorough empirical study of crime and design in public housing projects and urban apartment complexes." And the review goes on from there to be both, to acknowledge the sort of meticulousness of the study, but to also talk about how this is, as Ellis puts it, as a human, political, and moral affair. The study, the book, is profoundly reprehensible. So I don't think that I would ever assign the Pruitt-Igoe text by Bristol without assigning, I think, this review of defensible space. I also thought what was remarkable about it in reading it in this context is that it appeared in the Daily Californian, the UC Berkeley student newspaper. So the fact that this is actually, you know, he was published when Ellis, I think, was teaching at UC Berkeley, but it was published first in the student newspaper, which to me is a reminder of the things that Carolina started us off thinking about. One of her slides about the text by Regina Davis identified that the course that Regina Davis worked on emerged out of students' requests to be educated more about architects of color. And so I think, for me anyway, acknowledging that the journal is not just a repository of knowledge, but is actually a place that is, you know, responding to political moments and actually responding, I think, to student pressure for immediate change, which is something that I think we've seen much more recently in a more acute way that I think is really important. So I guess and I had a feeling this would happen. So along the subject of myths, I think to follow on the conversation that David began, the other text I thought was excellent was Katharina Rudy Ray's Bauhaus Hausfrau, Gender Formation and Design Education. And I loved that text because she reminds us, or I guess actually, to be honest, it was the first text that I had read that deeply analyzed the sort of symbolic gender equality of the Bauhaus, but revealed the systemic and structural ways in which gender equality was actually impossible in that model. And she writes something quite beautiful toward the end of the essay. So she identifies the sort of history of the Bauhaus, the history of the construction via the theater of a gender neutral character prototype, which we've all seen in Schlummer's, you know, different dance constructions, but that the gender neutral body is actually directed by the male. So there is some sort of inherent in the organization of the Bauhaus, even in these sort of gender neutral territories or performances, a sort of patriarchal construction, which she describes as the sort of defining fiction. What I loved about it was this line that I thought really applied to the moment, which is that she says, quote, "Identity formation is a crucial but usually unacknowledged part of education." And for me, that seemed like such a remarkable thing to, you know, as Carolina was saying at the very beginning of this panel, it's important to sort of pause at these moments and realize that there's an institutional memory that we're participating in, that these calls to think about the ways in which pedagogy becomes embodied in the discipline are actually not recent. They've existed for quite some time. And so I was really grateful to Katharina Rudy Roy for acknowledging that really at the turn of the millennium. So those are the two for me. I think Ellis's incredible review of defensible space and Katharina Rudy Roy's text on the Bauhaus Hausfrau, those two for me were quite remarkable.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that this is great. So that's exactly what I was hoping for, is that there would be enough overlap. I mean, I was thinking about some of the troubling words, right, that a few of you mentioned. So Carolina, you brought up the word multiculturalism as a kind of word that the meaning has perhaps shifted. It's certainly a lot more contested now than it used to be. And then David, your discussion of the term myth too, right, is something that we would perhaps use in a different way now. But these are terms that I think it's something that the three of us working on the book, we're constantly discussing and trying to figure out what do we do with these terms that we would perhaps ascribe new meanings to now or would use in different ways, but nonetheless at their time trying to see them in the kind of context of how the journal was being written and what issues were kind of coming to the fore at different times through its life. It was always fascinating to kind of see those transitions. for me, it really came through in the environment section, that word environment just gets completely used, I mean, in entirely different ways from one decade to the next decade, as if it had, you know, no meaning at all before it was reused in some other context. So it's fascinating to see those transitions and transformations across the decades.
I think the idea of research as well is another sort of plastic term that keeps reappearing in multiple iterations. And I think that, you know, David, your challenge about like expanding the idea of a myth beyond the practical work of the architects to even what we do in academia, and even like looking at the concept of research as we often describe it in academia as a form of myth, is an interesting one, and definitely an extension of the conversation that was specific to Pruitt-Igoe in that particular moment in time relative to the practice of modern architecture. Yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, one quick word is that I mean, you guys are the ones who went through every single year carefully, but I didn't get a sense of environment changing over time. I got a sense of it just having multiple meanings that show up in different places. Did you find in your longer readings a sense that these words were developing? The 1947 article on research could have been written today.
Yeah, I actually think research is one where the word tried to mean the same thing, but maybe we were just dancing around how to apply it to the field. So it was being applied in different ways. I actually feel like with environment, it really shifted in its meaning over time, that it really was just about the kind of area around a single building as the environment, to the way that it was used by the 1990s, when there's discussions about, having gone through an oil crisis and thinking about what environment means as far as kind of pollution and different understandings of that. It really did shift that one.
The other thing that we didn't maybe talk too much about was the proxies that are used, and maybe myth is the right word or better word, but what was interesting from my perspective at least was the reliance that so many authors have on other fields of inquiry. So sociology, for example, in the 70s, there were so many essays on sociology, and that, like, as a kind of Trojan horse to get at something else, was constantly appearing and reappearing. And in the 90s, when a lot of people turned to either literature or semantics, for lack of a better term, that became the kind of proxy by which to talk about things. And that seemed like a constant. There was always something that somebody was using to try to get at architecture. And I like how you phrase it as a myth, David, because it doesn't go away. It continues, right, all the time. And yeah, it was interesting to read all of them, to see that as a constant in a way.
Well, so I found the Mark Jarzenbeck article on interdisciplinary historiography, have I got the text right, was amazingly unnecessarily complex. So someone who's trying to make the point that you are making, but brings in Hegel in order to make it from outside of architecture, to make this point about how inside of architecture
exactly
works.
Well, he was just demonstrating his point, right?
Maybe that's right. It's purely performative.
It's exactly, like, not only am I going to tell you about it, but I'm going to show you too.
Did you ever figure out what the essay was actually about?
I could say something super snarky and I won't.
I'm curious. I don't know if this is a good prompt, maybe, and you don't have to answer if it's not a good prompt for a recorded discussion, but I'm curious if there were any texts that you wanted to include that just didn't make it into the book in the end, because I realized you were really constrained by the number of pages.
Yes, I think there was a long list. I mean, we had, so the process was read everything, and Carolina was part of that early phase, reading a lot. And try and put forward the articles that we felt like were most important to keep in. And we kind of had to keep winnowing it down. And with each time we winnowed, we felt like we were losing something really critical and important. So what would we bring forward? I'm trying to remember ones that were important that we lost. Some that were more like pieces of criticism was one area that we felt like we kept having to lose material from. So pieces that were really just kind of straight up architectural criticism, really describing a project, its context, analyzing it, offering a critique of it. There were some really nice ones that we in the end ended up cutting for a variety of reasons, perhaps.
I think the other part of it is that there were, for example, in the past 10 years, there's been a number of design essays, and we really only included one. And so there's a lot of design work that unfortunately didn't, we had a kind of token design piece, which I thought was Anna Miliaki's essay, which I think is fantastic on model mashup, but that's kind of representative of all the design work. And there's one essay on sociology, for example, when we could have included more. And so I think that it wasn't necessarily that one particular essay didn't make the cut. It was that like an essay maybe was put forward because it demonstrated, or it was a exemplar of another kind of set of essays that we couldn't include all of.
Nora, it's a fantastic question. I think it's one of the longest phases of our work. If I can reflect back, it really took us a while to narrow down to this number, because there were a number of amazing essays. And I think in addition to what Mark and Sarah said, I would just add, there were also a number of essays that were maybe specific to certain institutional histories of a particular school. Some of them kind of are reflected a little bit in the book, but we also tried to include the essays that are maybe about a broader topic that maybe cut across the field at large, rather than overemphasizing a single institution. But there are great essays about, in particular, like in the sort of early days of the journal, about different sort of aspects of history, let's say MIT in particular, or Berkeley, because that faculty tended to be at that time to be very involved, both with the ACSA and the journal. And if you can make a pitch to the audience, is to really go online and check out, either in your library or the texts that are available online. There's a number of really important essays that are published throughout the history of the journal that you would find interesting. In particular, what I also found personally very rewarding is, I think Carolina mentioned at the beginning, is the bibliographies. In rereading some of these essays, you revisit how the sort of the reading list of architects has shifted over decades. And some of them have become like classic reads. Other texts have fallen off the radar, but they're still quite significant. So I think looking closely into the kind of footnotes and endnotes was super rewarding intellectually for us as sort of book editors, because we got to kind of revisit how the field evolved intellectually. And for that reason, I think that's a real benefit of a peer-reviewed academic journal, because we did have that kind of thorough base to kind of build from.
For a kind of follow on from the idea of how did you make the selections. So Joni Mitchell, who in all things should be quoted, refused, I think still has refused, ever to make a best of album. She said, no, I made albums. Like, I don't want my stuff decontextualized. She didn't use that word, but pulled out from my albums and pretend, you put one beside another, it sounds like they have something to do with each other when they don't. So one of the things of doing the themes and putting them in a certain kind of order, it's as if they're speaking to each other, but obviously that's not true. That's an artifact of the artifact, right? So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that after having done it. So sometimes the juxtapositions will reveal something, but is it, what's your feeling on the selection process as a way of dealing with 75 years of history?
So one issue, David, is that the idea of a JAE as an album didn't really exist throughout the 75 years. So the journal content actually shifts quite a bit. So at the beginning, there was reports and proceedings and things like that. Then there was just a collection of random essays without themes. It wasn't until the 70s that a couple of themes began. There was a theme, for example, on Canada, so there's your Joni Mitchell reference for you, but it was "Oh Canada," right? So everything about Canada. But that went away in the 80s, and then it sort of comes back in fits and starts. But so there was not a kind of singular conception of the journal as an album per se. And so that made it, I think, a little bit easier. In the past decade, we have been using themes. So there have been an attempt to create an album around a theme, but it isn't necessarily consistent throughout the history. So I think that made it a little bit easier because they weren't really trying to talk to each other in one theme. That's my perspective, but Igor, Sarah.
Yeah, I think that that's right. I would just add that as we were putting the kind of 4 themes together, we were really trying to kind of build from this deep catalog, some narrative, some kind of intellectual structure that we could use to talk about what we had seen. And even recently, Igor and I were just talking the other day about the Richard Ingersoll article, which we left in the politics. We left in the politics section, but we thought could have worked really just as well in the environment section. It talks about the oil embargo and kind of reconceiving of very environmental kinds of questions the way we understand that word today. So there are definitely slippages between the themes, which we hope enriches the whole thing, but maybe, I don't know.
Definitely, I think there's a dialogue across that was sort of emerging as we formed these 4 themes. And one of the interesting conversation that we had as co-editors is, as you can tell from the titles of the themes, we haven't, pursued the chapter on, let's say, history theory or design or technology, because we felt, well, sometimes the curricular categories don't allow for cross-section, but then if you have a piece like Richard Ingersoll, which is one of the really earliest pieces on sustainability, which is actually super political. It's more political than actually environmental in some sense. It allows us to kind of pull it into a theme that can then touch upon, let's say there's a little bit of design, there's a little bit of politics about the Gulf War, obviously the environment, the idea of the, the food supply chain and everything. So that was one of the discoveries, I would say, in looking at these articles, because the initial sort of intuition and impulse was to look at the categories of design and history theory and technology and see how they've evolved and changed. But then as we look more closely, the cross-section, across different points in time led to these particular themes. And as, Sarah and Mark said, there is a potential for maybe some editors, a few decades down the road to regroup these in a different way, which I think would make it, for another potentially really interesting books. And I think that's where the website is really useful. If you go online and start to browse through these articles, I think people can put their own pairings in a really interesting way. People also cross-reference each other. That's an interesting thing. You can tell that many of the authors have read other articles, so they're referencing each other in a very, very interesting way as well, which is pretty amazing. I also love the idea of building on the book and Ozir's suggestion that we should add a playlist to Craig Wilkins's essay. I think that's just an amazing extension of the life of the essay in contemporary time, that hopefully in this era of technology, we can think about what does it mean for this book also to have eventually a future presence online and have some of these repositories added to it.
Well, that playlist might be in there. If you'll remember, this is the essay that has an entire page that in the layout of the book, it's 1 footnote. So there's a lot of kind of background to that essay that made it both super challenging in the layout phase of the work, but also one of the more rewarding ones, I think, to get to include. Yeah.
So what do you think about that hip hop list? Those songs from the rap songs of the early 90s are pretty not acceptable today. So do we really want to send people to listen to early 90s rap? Is that the suggestion? And then what do we do with that in today's world?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's the context of that work that Craig was kind of writing about in terms of the project that came out of the design of that space that he references. It's a great question, David. I mean, I think that we the studios that we taught this year had like other sonic playlists attached to them. I'm thinking again about about Curry and Jaleesa's work, that looked at DJ Screw, at Beat Your Feet, and others, that looked at voguing. I think also of Tandy Lowensen's studio that she taught on Black Flight, which referenced a Tribe Called Quest, among others. And so, I mean, I wonder, it's certainly not my wheelhouse, kind of musicology or that history, but I think it could be really interesting to, to me, like what was especially sort of striking was just how the issues that Craig was framing and writing about were, I think, so similar in a way to the themes and issues that, that Curry and Jaleesa were working on at Carleton this year. And so, so even 20 years later, I think similar questions around ceremony, around relationality, around the idea of the community that's sponsored in the making of music in space and how that is relevant. I mean, I think that there's, some amazing music from, the late 80s and 90s, and there's some really problematic, like music as well, like controversial, too. Part of that, I think, is a part of the discourse around, I think, what Craig means when he says self-defining energies, and how we decide to actually, choose the things that we listen to as a result. And so it's a great question. I do know that, that my playlist expanded a lot after reading, like Craig's text, and is doubly expanded, after Curry and Jaleesa's studio as well. So, yeah.
So we had a couple more questions for our panelists here today. Maybe this is a good time to turn to those. We thought we would kind of address one question to the current editorial team, and then a second question to the incoming editorial team. So the one to the current team, which is Carolina, Mark, and David, given the experience that you've had working on the journal, what do you see as the most significant contribution from its past that could be significant for its future? So how would you position that? And then for the incoming team, the question we thought we would ask is, as you are new to these roles and kind of getting your feet under you as you're about to begin, how do you see the journal, kind of the potential for the journal to change in the future? Kind of what direction do you see for it? So we can open this up, and I can call on people, or if you want to just start a conversation, that's fine too.
Carolina, David, why don't one of you start?
I can maybe start. I've been 4 years in the journal, and one of the things that I felt my role was as associate editor, and I completely committed to that, was a kind of a role of extreme invisibility. And by saying that, I mean, like there were things that Mark and Amy and Ivan were developing when I started, and they had just started to emerge. I remember design content, for example, I remember Amy telling me, like, we're having a really hard time getting design content. Sarah, you were in the committee. We went through these phases of either we would receive project descriptions, or we would just having a really hard time to getting design content, and having an informed discussion around the knowledge that is produced around design content. Which goes, of course, beyond description, beyond just explaining what the project was about. Also, we didn't have many authors actually engaging with the production of architecture as building, submitting. So I think one of the work that for me has been important is to find depth in the work, and by doing that, I think the design committee and the work that I've done this year has been just a lot of deep work with the essays, and I think that has created a really strong foundation for where the design content is right now in the journal. I think I was while I was waiting for this meeting to happen, I was counting how many essays I've edited since I started, and I counted more than 75. And it's really a huge amount in such a short time, but it's not like it was always that way. I think it has really increased a lot along the years, and I think it's become, I don't know, I think it's been inspiring how authors submit more content. I think we've doubled the amount of submissions we receive. It's really grew a lot in a short time. And I think what I'm trying to say is that there's something in depth that I think is super important. So it's not just about making ground, but it's actually really cultivating the ground and letting for some more continuity. So I think one thing that we see a lot from past perhaps editors or the past of the journal is every time there was a new editor, there were like all these changes, and then there were all these new ways of approaching the work. And I feel something that has been really healthy from my perspective is continuity. And I think that's, I don't know, it sets a really nice ground for where the journal is. And it's just super nice to see, for example, I received a book the other day by an author that published a micronarrative at the very beginning, and now it's become a book project, and you stay in touch with the authors, and it's been this super healthy dialogue about how the work can just also be cultivated. So something that I feel is important, perhaps from the past, is to learn that, yeah, I guess to be an editor is also to create places of invisibility, in the sense of invisibility as a condition of you just work a lot in things that you see good that they are there, and I think there's something good to learn about that. So it's not about making these radical changes or shifts, but actually going deep, and that's perhaps where you obtain the most radicality. So yeah, that's something that to me is important, and that I've seen. So I didn't create a new category, for example, or there was not a lot of changes when I started my tenure. But I think it's been really rewarding to just really stay low and going deep. So I hope that can be continued.
Well, and I think you talked, it was a kind of process of shepherding the whole team on the committee to learn how to kind of incubate the good projects and help the authors kind of come into their own. And I think that's something that you're particularly great at doing.
Thank you.
David, do you want to comment?
Sure. I think I'm both the past and the future, right? Janice phase. The thing that I've really appreciated on the board is the attempt at the only word I have is governance, which is not the right word, but what's important is not necessarily the specific content that will be renewed by the actual people and contributors and so on, but you should have a process in place that is transparent and fair and open and constructive. That's what you need. So our review board has been separated from the theme journals, or the print journal, sorry, which allows an independence to the board from, I can tell authors quite directly that no, the other editors aren't influencing what I'm doing. It's quite direct and clear in a way that it didn't, other journals I've been in haven't been so clearly organized. And I think those are hard, maybe a bit unlike Caroline, I think those are hard things to hold on to. The United States has seen quite a year where those traditions and institutions of governance actually are quite fragile. So I don't know, I think the journal will probably end up quite some other different place 10 years from now. And in a bigger one last thing would be to step back a little bit from the journal to the place of architecture schools and universities. So, 20 years ago, we had the University of Excellence, or we had centers of excellence, and everybody was trying to be excellent. And that morphed into the quantifiable university, where everybody has to be doing research. And so now everything that anybody does, if you sharpen your pencil, that's research. If you write a poem in a British school, you get to call that research, and you must call it research, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not clear to anyone that I follow kind of thing, any research that I read, what the next steps are. Those always emerge organically. So I think the journal has been incredibly nimble. I guess, Mark, that's part of your own thinking. I don't know exactly. I'm going from behavior, not from having actually picked your brain on it. And it's interesting to try to anticipate maybe this time instead of just react, where the attention economy is taking us, where the university is actually, that the schools are part of. So not looking internally to what's going on in architecture, but a little bit outwards to what's going on in the university. Maybe not all the way to society. That's a long way away from design studio, but at least outside of our own building front doors.
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree that there is change. One of the points of calling the book The Evolving Project is not only a reference to the original title, but it really the journal has evolved, and I don't imagine in 10 years it will be the same thing. But to Caroline's point, you do have to have some stability, and there's the sort of essential value for me is that it provides a place for authors to publish in the peer-reviewed context. Double-blind peer review still holds some value. We reach North American, I should say US and Canadian schools of architecture. We're one of the two journals of the ACSA. So all those things, I think, have a certain value to them. But I think, you know, underneath that, there needs to be some sort of infrastructure that actually, as David says, is transparent, is open, works. You know, that is also, I think, really valuable. One of the issues we had really early on was that authors just weren't getting reviews back in time. You know, and so if you send a review in or send an essay in, and it sits in review for a year or so, that's not a very, you know, that's not very valuable to anybody. So I think just having that sort of systems in place that work, that we know how the workflows go, et cetera, is also kind of unseen, but important. But I think there's a bigger question about impact, and I'm not sure how to sort of approach that. And we get news so quickly, we get information, quote unquote, information so quickly. The journal's a slow thing, and it's meant to be slow in some ways. I don't think we are nimble enough to be quick or to be responsive. And so we do need to be much more strategic in how we align ourselves, how we orient ourselves, et cetera. Because as we've seen in the last couple of years, like, you know, we can't react, like we're too slow, you know, like it doesn't work. And we don't have impact, right? The way impact is measured is something we'll never, you know, be good at. So I don't know, I mean, I think change is the only, you know, change will happen. I think change makes things possible. So that's a good thing. But having some, you know, strategic vision on a long-term planning process, and also having the recognition that things are going to be slow, and that's not a bad thing, I think will help the journal.
Zara and Nora, do you want to talk a little bit? I mean, there's been some really great issues thrown out on the table here. I'm particularly excited to hear about attention economy, impact, like how are we going to, how does the journal do that? We've talked a little bit about, you know, the kind of state of this as a book project, you know, how often is it going to be in the future that we keep making book projects, especially book projects that are republishing things that are already available. We've talked about this. So anyway, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
I mean, I think what Mark said is kind of the crux of an academic journal, right? That we're not places, we're not even you know, a commercially available journal. We're a journal that is already set through 2022. We already know everything we're publishing for the next, actually 23, I think. So I think that the point about not being reactive is absolutely critical. I also think that there are just simply social and cultural forces that are present and have been present for 30 years that are just now becoming vocal or you know, vocal in the mainstream. And so I don't think that the journal necessarily needs to react. I don't think that's something that we can or should do. You know, we have a working editorial board, that's how it functions, which means it's a bunch of overworked people contributing one more thing to their, you know, to their regular practice. We're all teaching full time, but I do think that the nature of being an academic journal and publishing academics needs to be aware of the transformation of the university, as David was saying. So we have, you know, we know that tenure track positions are no longer the norm. We know that many of our authors are not tenure track faculty, they're PhD students, they're practitioners and they're scholars. They either are, you know, adjacent to an institution, or perhaps they've even formed their own institution intentionally with a collective outside of, you know, the overarching umbrella of a singular institution. So from my perspective, you know, knowing that we are a peer-reviewed journal and knowing that we only get content from people who have the time and space and institutional support to write peer-reviewed content, part of what becomes curious to me is, do we actually do a little bit of work? Do we raise funds or create opportunities for people to have short-term fellowships or other relationships with the journal that allow them to produce work? I mean, that's just throwing something out there that other journals have been doing for a while, and maybe not academic journals, but if we are looking at ourselves as an academic, I don't know, construct or something that reflects academia, I think we need to be a little more nimble about how we think of our audience and how we support the folks who are actually producing things very generously for the journal. And then, you know, to the question of accessibility, I think, you know, it raises really important questions. We currently have a website, and that website is the front door to the Taylor and Francis website, right? So we have this sort of space that perhaps we could start to think about as being J+. I don't know if the website could actually start to be developed as a place where we do publish work that intentionally isn't immediately indexed. That's a question that we've been raising on the editorial board. These are a few questions that have been raised with folks on the editorial board. And then the question of social media, you know, is social media only something vapid, or is social media a way of actually extending the imprint of the journal so that we have a different set of metrics that are not reliant upon the way that science and other, you know, as Mark has stated, you know, the JE is not publishing precedent-based scholarship. We're not a law journal, right? So in order for a piece of scholarship to circulate, perhaps it, you know, needs to be coasting along other platforms besides just the print imprint of the journal or the website imprint of the journal. So those are all questions about accessibility, sharing scholarship, and I think the changing nature of who actually writes for the Journal of Architectural Education and what their position is relative to institutional support. And then I think the other, you know, for me, the exciting opportunity is to have this chance to work with an entire incredible you know, working board, to get a chance to work with David, who, as he said, is both facing, you know, the previous leadership and then facing forward, who's done so much work to expand what reviews can be. And then to bring in a new design editor, Ozair, who is somebody that, you know, I've had the pleasure of working with on a number of different student reviews and contexts, but to actually say, you know, how do design editors, review editors, and executive editors work together to reshape a vision for the journal. And we've seen that, you know, I loved the introduction to this book because it made clear that with new design leadership, with new executive editor leadership, things did shift and they changed, and that that's actually necessary. If it were to stop changing, I think this journal would die. So I'm excited to work with Ozair. I'm excited to see what design content and scholarship could be in the future, and to work with David and look at how, you know, reviews can be expanded even beyond what's happening currently. And yeah, it's really exciting to think about it. Certainly, I think all the questions that were raised and the things that I've learned from Mark over our year of transitional meetings, you know, these aren't things that get solved overnight at all. You know, as Mark said, this is a very slow process. So I think sticking to the tasks, prioritizing, and you know, as Carolina said, digging in and doing the work really are necessary.
You know, in March, I was invited to sit in on a board meeting, and I got to see sort of just how generously and productively the space for conversations was set both by Mark and by Carolina, whose session that I was, you know, sitting in on. And so I think that that's in a way part of the continuum that I would just love to make sure we try to maintain moving forward, because I think that that creates space for smart people in the room to be able to say the things that they need to say, and to talk about the work in the way that they need to do that. And I'm actually I'm super nervous about working with this board because they're all brilliant, smart, like incredible people. And so I'm just really, you know, sort of like thrilled to have the opportunity to be able to learn with them and from them. I mean, I think that, you know, both Mark and Carolina and David and Nora spoke to some of the things that I would like to kind of, you know, try to foreground a bit moving forward. I think, Mark, we talked about impact, and I think one of the impacts like has already happened in the journal, which is that it's, you know, contributions have been pluralized. I think, Carolina, you talked about just how much, you know, contributions have expanded and grown. And I think that is impact. I mean, I think that, you know, there are still, of course, you know, other kinds of impacts. How do we increase and further pluralize contributions to the journal from scholars and designers and precarious faculty and researchers that, you know, perhaps don't have institutional supports the way that, you know, like typical, you know, sort of, you know, like academics might. You know, I think both Catherine, you know, Catherine Anthony and Meltem Gurel wrote in their text on, you know, the canon and the void about the still persistent, you know, kind of, you know, lack and absence of Black, Indigenous, and researchers and writers of color. And that was written, you know, so long ago and is relevant absolutely still today. And so for students and faculty who don't see themselves in the discipline that we teach, how can the journal be positioned to help with that in some way to kind of further pluralize those voices, you know, like those voices even more? They both actually referenced Edward Said in the conclusion of their text. They talked about how, like society and culture are like heterogeneous, products of heterogeneous peoples. And so to that, I would just add that, Said also talks about the permission to narrate. And so how do you kind of open the door even further for people to tell stories and to share their work, in that way? I think that, like Nora also spoke about the idea of the kind of social media aspect of the journal. And, Mark talked about the kind of the slow process of publication. I think that we can do both. There is the slow burn and the slow cook that is like really necessary for, part of the editorial and writing and publishing process. And I think there are ways in which we might be able to really leverage the website in a really, really interesting way so that we can be super current with things for timelines that we've already planned years out for. And I think it might allow us to take advantage of scholarship that would otherwise get lost because it doesn't quite fit the theme, for this issue or the next issue and others. And so, to me, that's incredibly, incredibly exciting. And maybe lastly, I think, like personally for me, I'm really interested in sort of investing in and poking at and disrupting, perhaps what Sarah and Igor and Mark, like what you write about in the introduction to the book, when you talked about how the organizing of the subject matter of the book, sort of ran counter, I think, to the usual subcategories of like history, theory, representation, design, and tech, and so on. And so I'd like to see how the journal might be able to like constructively upend some of those subcategories in the way that we might pluralize things down the line. But I'm just really excited to be working with these like incredible scholars and designers. I think it's really quite remarkable, the infrastructure that Mark and others have put into place. And I think, like really respecting that and building on it is going to be very exciting.
It's a really important perspective of the kind of processes. I think David mentioned that, like, what are the historical processes of the journal? What are the contemporary processes of the journal? And there is a kind of a parallel processes of the scholarship and how the scholarship is evaluated, promoted, revised, but also the democratization, how do we increase the participation and the impact, in a field that honestly, even to this day, has very few outlets of this kind. So I think all of those comments are very important. And in the history of the journal, we can see the arc of kind of transition of making even the process, the democratic process of the board emerging really relatively like in the last decades, and then in the initial period being a very different process, and then also the multiplicity of the kinds of submissions that now had micro narratives and interviews and traditional essays. So really, really, really important comment. So processes could also be difficult. They could also be in a way messy and complicated. They're always hard to find like one thing fits all. So we did have one maybe more quick or maybe not so quick question before we turn to some questions from the audience, to in particular Carolina, Mark, and David, which is maybe what was the most controversial thing you had to do as an editor? Because it is a decision-making process that involves the board, that involves the collective, but also you in your own particular role. So what was it for you that was the most difficult thing you had to do?
I can't say publicly.
Me neither.
Okay, Carolina.
We are being recorded after all.
I can jump in. I think there's been two issues that have been really interesting to me that and difficult in the same way. One of them had to do with the issue of plagiarism that is really, really complex. The idea of intellectual rights or intellectual property, who owns ideas, how are those ideas expressed and translated and copied or not, that's been one particularly very difficult issue. And it's only happened a couple of times, but in one instance, it's been very, very, very complicated. The second had to do with two essays that we were planning to publish that we ended up only publishing one of them. And it touches on some of these questions around impact and around relevance and around being current. One of them had to do with an accusation of sexual harassment in Richard Meyer's office. And, we looked at the original submission and you know, were frankly had many discussions about the legal implications of printing something like that. And we ended up printing a reflection on events, which was a way to get at the issue, but not necessarily fall under the same terms of journalism, which that issue popped up in another essay. And it was a very, there are a number of very serious and difficult conversations to get through, where you had on one hand the intention to actually publish something in the journal that was maybe political, contemporary, that seemed like it was the right thing to do. And on the other hand, really asking what was the role of the journal relative to scholarship. I mean, is that scholarship, right? And we publish opinion pieces, we publish reflection pieces, and you know, where did this one fall? And it was a really, like I said, there were a lot of very difficult conversations, but it was in the end very educational for me, as with the other issue of plagiarism. So those two topics, I think, have been really difficult to get through. Otherwise, I mean, I have to say that my time on the journal has been incredibly joyful. I mean, it's been fun. You know, I get to meet all these great people, talk to people, have dinner with people, you know, and be in the same room with people that I really admire, reconnect with people. So it's on the whole, it's been amazing, but those two issues have been difficult.
That's great. So maybe a question, we can turn to the audience questions now. And we have one that's come in from Tom Fisher. Tom, you're welcome to unmute yourself and read your question yourself, or I can happily read it for you. But this is really kind of taking us in a shift that goes towards like, where is the journal going now? So it'd be great. Ask away.
Sure, Sarah, thank you. Just really wondered about the length of articles. It strikes me, I mean, for many years, I was the editor of PA and have continued to be an editor of journals. And it strikes me that the 1,500 and the 7,000 word guidelines strike me as being very, as I say in my question, very Procrustean. In other words, it strikes me that as an editor, you don't sort of prejudge length, you judge content. And if a really great article comes in at 4,000 words, you publish it. And so I just wondered why JE has had those kind of word limits, and is there some idea that it might actually be a little bit more flexible in article length?
Just to give you, and Tom, it's good to see you. I hope you're well. The limits are really guidelines. We're about to publish an essay that's 3,500 words, and another one I think is 4,500. So when they come in and they get through the peer review process, we don't stop them for that. The one thing we kind of get a little bit nervous about it is if something's like 15,000 words, you know, and like that's maybe should be a book somewhere or something. But we have been pretty easy on that. And Nora, that's a fantastic opportunity for you to edit the webpage.
Right, good idea. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, if anyone has any final questions, we're happy to take those now, but we only have a few minutes left. So we need to get those in quickly. But we should acknowledge again, Mark and Carolina's contributions to the journal over their many years. So Carolina will be stepping down in the end of June, I think, having served on the journal for 4 years, leading invisibly, but with great leadership nonetheless, the design committee. And I had the very great pleasure of getting to serve on the committee right at the same time that Carolina started, and it was an excellent experience. And then Mark, after many years at the helm of this institution, having done so much work to kind of, as David talked about, its governance, to kind of run things and make those systems actually work. And maybe they're seeming a little bit too rigid now because of the good work that you've done to get it to that state. So thank you for your contributions to the journal, of course. And also, it was such a pleasure to work with you on this book.
Thank you. It's been great. You should mention how we can buy the book too.
Oh yeah, that's coming next. Don't worry.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you would like to buy a copy of the book, we can put in the chat, I have to pull it up, a link to Oro Editions, who is the publisher for the book. They are currently putting it on back order. Here's our link. But they promise us that it will be available in the coming weeks, if not weeks, a couple of months. So please do get a copy, request that your library get a copy, and dig into this book and revisit all of these great articles that our panelists today have suggested. Well, thank you then to all of the panelists. Thank you, Carolina, David, Ozair, Nora, and Mark, Igor as well. And thank you also to Carol, who's been controlling things silently in the background as we've gone through today and setting up the event. So thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. It's great to see you.
Very nice to see you.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.